Dzień dobry, przy mikrofonie Jakub Dymek
i Marcin Giełzak, a to jest podcast Dwie Lewe Ręce, a konkretnie kolejny odcinek z serii o książkach. Tym razem rozmawiamy o pracy za Putina, mroczny portret faszystowskich ruchów młodzieżowych w Rosji, które to praca ukazała się nakładem wydawnictwa Prześwity. Książkę poleca Financial Times, pisząc o przejmującym dziennikarskim śledztwie. Poleca ją także Peter Pomarancew, autor jednych z najlepszych prac na temat Rosji, które ukazały się w ostatnich latach, i z czystym sumieniem możemy ją polecić też my, bo naprawdę z tej książki można się dowiedzieć rzeczy niezwykłych, szokujących i przerażających na temat rosyjskiego reżimu i jak sądzę pomaga ona też lepiej zrozumieć, dlaczego Rosja napadła na Ukrainę i dlaczego ta wojna jest prowadzona w tak brutalny sposób. Ian Garner, autor książki, to postać, jak za chwilę zobaczycie, niezwykle ciekawa, człowiek o wielkiej kulturze historycznej, człowiek, który umie opowiadać w sposób jednocześnie erudycyjny, jak i bardzo przystępny. Autor, którego publikowano m.in. w New York Timesie, Guardianie czy Washington Post, a który teraz wystąpi w podcaście Dwie Lewe Ręce.
Przed wami rozmowa długa, wielowątkowa i momentami wymagająca, ale więcej tajemnic nie zdradzę, bo nie chcę wszak odbierać nikomu przyjemności z tego, co zaraz usłyszy. Nie będzie natomiast tajemnicą, ani żadnego sekretu nie ujawnię, gdy powiem, że możecie pomóc nam tworzyć więcej rozmów takich jak ta, którą usłyszycie za chwilę. Aby to zrobić, wystarczy zajrzeć na patronite.pl/DLR i wybrać jeden z progów wsparcia, bo to właśnie dzięki waszemu wsparciu tworzymy takie rozmowy, rozwijamy ten program i wprowadzamy do niego nowe formaty. Ci, którzy nas wspierają, uzyskują dostęp nie tylko do cotygodniowych dogrywek, czyli ekstra materiałów do odcinków, ale także naszej grupy na Discordzie, newslettera, zaproszeń na spotkania na żywo, najbliższe już niebawem, i wielu innych rzeczy, a przede wszystkim ci, którzy nas wspierają, dokładają swoją cegiełkę do zobowiązania, które podjęliśmy, stworzenia pierwszego, niezależnego, obiektywnego, odważnego medium po lewej stronie. Jeśli chcecie do tej misji się przyłączyć i swoją cegiełkę dołożyć, to wiecie, gdzie zajrzeć, a my, nie przedłużając już tego wstępu i nie odwlekając momentu, w którym usłyszycie naszego gościa najgoręcej, zapraszamy do wysłuchania wywiadu z Ianem Garnerem.
Hello, Ian. Thank you for joining us and for giving us this opportunity to talk about your new book, which is titled Generation Z into the Heart of Russia's Fascist Youth. It has only very recently appeared in Polish, so to all of our viewers, you can buy it now. And for giving us the opportunity to talk about this very sobering and very important book.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me and for giving me the chance to have what's probably going to be one of the more miserable conversations you have in the next few days.
In a couple of weeks, yeah, thanks. And good to see you, Ian. Thanks for your time and being here with us.
Yes, so I should like to begin with asking you about the very title of your book, or its subtitle. Now, most people in journalism and academia shy away from any mention of the word fascist, because people will automatically start shouting Godwin's law, far-fetched, alarmist, sensationalist. So how would you respond to those who would doubt your intentions?
Well, you know, when I was choosing the book title, I knew there is a shock factor in this, right? And I knew that people were going to find it shocking. But what Russia's government is and what Russia's political culture has become is extremely shocking. And I can talk more about what the nature of fascism is in a second, but we've erected this barrier around the F word that is so high that we actually refuse, I think, in media and popular culture discourse to really consider the fact that people can commit crimes that are absolutely abominable, which is just an integral part of what fascism is. And when we erect that wall, we build it so high, we actually refuse to countenance what we really need to do to think about how to deal with countries like Russia. And, you know, speaking to people in Poland is a bit like preaching to the converted, because you're right there and, you know, you're just looking over your garden wall at what Russia is doing. But when I speak to people here in Canada or, where I grew up in Britain or in the States, people are really, really surprised by what is happening in Russia. They really do not understand the reality of life under Putin. But when we think about what fascism actually is, Russia hits the definition pretty well. So it is a country that is built around a myth of national regeneration and national rebirth. The idea that, and it's not hard to find this material in the popular culture, that Russia is under attack from diseases, diseased people who are amongst us within Russia, who are somehow sort of, infecting the body politic. And the response is not to compromise. The response is not to find some way of curing those people. The cure is to kill those people, to eliminate them, to destroy them, whether that is physically, as we're seeing in Ukraine, or whether that's to destroy them psychologically, as we're seeing with many people in Russia.
On the other hand, though, isn't naming and shaming Russia for its fascist inclinations, taking the blame of the Western leaders and absolving them of any political responsibility for conducting relations with Russia? It's always something that Mark Galeotti said to me. When we deem Russia and Russia's leaders crazy, illogical, or fascist even, we absolve ourselves of the mistakes of our own policy and our responsibility for creating and maintaining Russia policy in the future. Because if we believe there is nobody reasonable there to reason with, and it's just pure evil on the other side, we also absolve our leaders of our own actions, their inactions, the decisions, and the and steps they take or wish or elect not to take regarding Russia.
So I think there are several questions in there, one of which you posed as a fact, and that is the idea that Russia's leaders, if we call them fascist, we state that they are madmen, essentially. And I actually don't think this is true. And there was a great debate about this in the 1930s and the 1940s. How can you engage with people who are mad? And the answer is, and it is ongoing today in the political science literature, you can look into the so-called madman theory. What I'm not encouraging us to do in any way is to write off Russia as mad or as illogical. It is illogical if you look at it in the strictly rational sense of the world. If you go to take a philosophy course in logic in the Western world and try and apply that here, you're going to come a cropper. But there is an internal logic to the thinking. And it's actually extremely logical according to its own rules, which are fantastic, which are mythical, and which are based on allegory. But it's more like trying to engage with people who are extreme religious people. And we have great experience of doing that with diplomacy, with regimes like, for example, Iran, with regimes like North Korea. And you could argue that North Korea is, dominated by a form of essentially religion based around leader worship. Right? We know how to deal with those people. And the second question then is, are we absolving Western leaders of their responsibility to have done anything over the last 20 years? And that is a very different question. And I think this is where we've consistently fallen down on Russian policy. And in fact, I would say that begins even earlier than Putin, really in the mid-1990s with Chechnya, the first Chechen war. And I strongly believe that Putin looked at that war, which was waged with absolute disregard for the norms of war, such as they are, absolute disregard for international humanitarian law. And the Western response was pretty much fine words. We believe in liberal values. We believe in, you not going and brutally murdering thousands of people and your forces not behaving in a way that's too abhorrent to go into in a podcast. Putin looked at that and thought, well, I can do the same. And when he was working in Chechnya in the early 2000s, and that was, of course, the first major war that he waged, it just so happened that the war against terrorism came along at a very, very convenient time for him, when essentially he was given carte blanche to echo the actions of Western leaders, in behaving in a way that did cast international law aside, that did cast humanitarian law aside, and that, you know, many people will debate this, but I think cast basic ethical standards that we should all adhere to as human beings aside.
Well, I don't know if you know that story, but it's a very telling one. Back in the latter half of the 19th century, the French Academy of Science, I think it was, did a call for papers on the subject of the elephant. And the Polish scientist, without missing a beat, submitted a paper entitled "The Elephant and the Polish Question." So it is our tendency to always look for the Polish aspect in everything. So I was wondering if you could tell a Polish audience what role, if any, has Poland to play in the political imaginarium of Russia's elite and in the discourse that is propagated by the sort of youth organizations that you write about in your book.
So let me tell you with a really specific example. Now, you've all probably heard about these new mandatory patriotism lessons that are being taught in Russian schools as of the beginning of last academic year, the Разговоры о важном, conversations about important things is the usual translation, although I think the translation softens the actual Russian a little bit. Now, these are centrally produced by the Kremlin. You can log on to the Ministry of Education's website and you can find full lesson plans with slideshows, videos, scripts, ways to engage with the students, grade by grade, all the way up to, you know, school leaver age. And there was a lesson plan just earlier this month for the Day of National Unity, which is, I believe, the 4th of November. I might have the exact date wrong. Somebody will leap in on the comments and tell me if I've got it a day or two out. And, you know, this was picked out as the important theme, the vital theme for that week's lesson. And what children were taught across age groups was that Russia historically has had to defend itself from invaders from the outside, and that it is the moments of defense that have defined what it means to be Russian. Russia is fated to continue playing out moments of great national defense, if you read these scripts, pretty much forevermore. Again, it's not logical, it's not rational, but we're thinking about this sort of allegorical, not chronological time, right? We're thinking in terms of myth. The central historical event in the lesson plan was beginning of the 17th century. Poland invades Russia, Poland is attacking Moscow, and a couple of Russian plucky folk heroes lead the militiamen to defeat Poland. And so the great enemy is Poland. And Poland, if you look at the propaganda for the last couple of years, has come to figure in quite a big way in the Russian imagination as an underhanded, shadowy kind of a country that is hell-bent on the destruction of Russia, on weakening Russia, and of attacking Russian speakers in Ukraine. And this is often projected as a Polish desire to recapture its historical empire. You know, and again, we're going back to like the 17th century here in the 18th century. This is pretty mad stuff. It's pretty out there. But with a desire, for example, to invade Western Ukraine. All of this is laced through with a sort of conspiracy theory logic and the words of conspiracy theorists. And, even reading those lesson plans, it really does feel like you're reading some of that sort of weird stuff that you can read on the internet from time to time.
With yellow subtitles and all that. So basically, Poland here prefigures Napoleon in 1812, and then the Kaiser, and then Hitler, and then Ronald Reagan, which is basically the West, which is hell-bent on destroying Mother Russia.
Yeah. And of course, the irony is that for all of the terror and the fears about Poland trying to reclaim its historical empire, what's Russia's actual stated goal repeatedly over the last couple of years? Well, it's the rebuilding of the so-called Ruski Mir. It's Eurasianism. It's from Vladivostok to all the way over to Portugal. This is a sort of, again, it's spiritual. It's not logical. Nobody is going to invade Portugal. Well, certainly Moscow is not going to invade Portugal. But it's the idea, again, of recreating this sort of utopian past. It is, to borrow a little bit from Donald Trump, it is make Russia great again, in a nutshell.
Although that territorial claims argument is obviously nonsense on its face, the second ideological part, I mean the political part, is not... There is some ring of truth to it, because it is a reason of state in Poland, quite openly claimed by the political elites, that indeed weakening Russia and keeping Russia out of European system and possibly minimizing its potential for as long as it could in the future as it could possibly be maintained. Well, it is a stated objective, but I want to
keeping the Americans in, the Germans down, and the Russians out is Polish foreign policy in a nutshell.
Yeah, although there is a lot of wishful thinking in that too. But I'm going to dwell a little bit on this conflict between the imaginary and the real. And now I have two questions pertaining to that. The first is, how is Russia's national myth of self-defense different from other countries that have professed the same myths over and over again and made them part of the national identity? I can think from Serbia to Vietnam. Many countries sharing the same conception of itself as being defined by external threat and fighting against imperialist or Western forces. So this is the question number one. And the second is, yeah, let's stay with the first one for now. I won't overburden you with two at once.
Good. I'm glad you stopped there, because I have two parts to this answer.
Sure.
The first is that this is in the imaginary that the Russian state has created, and this is not an entirely new creation, but these are the elements of national history that it is drawing together. It is the spiritual aspect of it that is central. And it actually goes back before the 17th century, before Poland, all the way to 1453. 1453 is the really key date. What happened in 1453? Well, way off from Moscow, when Moscow wasn't really actually a particularly significant power, Constantinople falls.
As opposed to Kiev.
Right, as opposed to Kiev. We'll get to that, I'm sure. So we have our first Rome in Rome, right? Actual Rome, real Rome. Well, that's no longer a good Rome because of the split between the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church. Thus, before 1453, we have Second Rome, that's Constantinople. Now Constantinople has fallen to the Muslims. The only major capital that is an Orthodox capital becomes Russia, right? Or becomes Moscow, rather. And therefore we have this theory of Moscow as the Third Rome, which becomes increasingly significant and is very central to Slavophile thinking in the 19th century. And indeed, you could argue as well, and I believe Katerina Clark, who's a great historian, argues that there is something of this in the communist revolution as well, where Moscow is at the vanguard. Moscow is the only communist power for some time, and Moscow takes the spiritual lead. But what makes this different? What makes this so important is how often in the Russian historical imagination this is married to not just a myth of self-defense, but a myth of sacrifice and death and resurrection. And this is a plug for my first book, which is about the Battle of Stalingrad and the myth of Stalingrad, available now from all good bookstores, but sadly not in Polish translation. Stalingrad and the war, as we know, are hugely, hugely important to Russian culture. And the myth of war under Putin has absolutely amplified the idea that it is not merely regrettable that 1 million people died at Stalingrad to save Stalingrad and save the West and therefore save the world. Well done, Russia. Once again, you saved the world. And in this myth, it is very much Russia and not the Soviet people, which included many non-Russians. it is not merely regrettable that this happened, it is essential that this happened. And when you read about the war, when you read about Stalingrad, Russia has to die. Stalingrad literally dies in the stories. The city is described as dead. And then, lo and behold, there's a miraculous turnaround at Stalingrad, November the 19th, 1942. Huge counterattack, hugely improbable. The city literally comes back to life. Read around the stories. The next time you hear Russians speaking about the war, notice how often we see this, the antipodes of dark and light, death and life, old day, dawn, and so on and so forth. This is, to come back to this religion idea, this is the Christian myth, right? Jesus has to die to save the world. Jesus takes the sins of humanity on himself. So this is now transposed into this Russian nationalist context. That makes it a highly potent idea, because while not every Russian believes that, you know, I'm going to go out and sacrifice myself, there is increasingly this narrative that the more we suffer, the more we struggle, the more we die, the greater the eventual turnaround must inevitably be.
And let me hit you with the second one, because it connects to this as well. There is this conflict, or rather polemic, between authors who believe that Putin's goals and Russia's goals are transcendental in a sense, or transhistorical in a sense, and purely ideologically motivated. I would count myself Timothy Snyder in that camp, yeah, believing that Russia is an eternally fascist state, that Putin is motivated by highly ideological reasons, which comes from his upbringing, his lectures, his inspirations, his personal vision of Russia's history, is what drives him. And the second camp, I would put people like Anatol Lieven, for example, in that camp, tend to see Russia as a country with purely political objectives. It tries to maximize its potential, utilize its military might to achieve a certain goals within the realm of the possible. And those people in that camp would treat this whole ideological, quasi-religious, spiritual edifice as some form of rationale for what is strictly political. In which camp, if any, would you count yourself, and how do you connect this to the previous answer about the foundational Christian myths of Russian nationalism?
I mean, it's a great question, and a very well described, or a very good description of where I think scholarship stands right now. And it's, I would say, pretty obvious that I belong in the former camp. But I am absolutely open to persuasion about elements of the political goals. And I think we can talk about short-term goals that Russia might have that are political. But when you look at the evolution of the Putinist state over the last, it's almost 25 years now, it has become increasingly nationalist, increasingly ideological, and increasingly hard to explain behavior by political goals at all. And for example, as a case study, we might just take the question of internal political control, which, you know, if Putin is just your sort of regular, plain Jane authoritarian dictator, well, all he really wants to do is control the population, steal a shit ton of money, and make out pretty good, right? Then why launch this war in 2022? You don't need to. Why launch the war in 2014? You don't need to. Why interfere militarily in Ukraine when, even after the Maidan revolution, given the amount of corruption, the amount of sort of democratic fragility in Ukraine, it would have been relatively easy to continue to exert huge political and economic pressure on Ukraine and bring it back under Moscow's control, or at least very much restrict its ability to move westwards and think about joining NATO or the European Union, which, even after the blunders that Moscow has made in the last 10 years, those goals still remain hugely distant, right? Ukraine is not about to step foot into NATO and the European Union today. If you're open to reading an excellent new book on this, Alexander Etkind probably belongs to the other camp and is a really good thinker about trying to think how the two camps might bridge. And he has a new book, Russia Against Modernity, which is all about asking whether foreign policy behavior and domestic behavior is driven by concerns about fossil fuel usage and the fact that many Western countries and Ukraine are trying to move away from dependence on fossil fuels, and that will basically tank the Russian economy, tank the Russian state, and potentially lead to the breakup of the Russian Federation. So it's a really interesting read.
Okay, so now it's my turn to ask a multifaceted question filled with $10 words. Now, you've mentioned quite often, you do mention it in your book time and time again, and you did mention it in this conversation as well, the sort of Russian spiritualism. And it's not your normal everyday garden variety nationalism. There is a spiritualist element to it. And when I hear the top Russian propagandists, people like Dugin, people like Solovyov, they often mention something that they call a special Russian truth. And they say it is not your kind of truth. It is not your Aristotelian empirical definition of truth. It is our special truth. But they never quite tell you what that truth is. I mean, it never becomes a statement. Have you, during your journeys to Russia and through the Russian psyche, ever managed to understand what is the truth that they want to tell us or that they want to tell themselves? What is that they see that we don't?
There are several components to this. The first is that there is an element of mere oppositionality about this. And repeatedly, when you read these statements and when you read texts written by these figures, you will discover that Russia exists less as something to be defined and more as something that is defined by what it is not. And in fact, just today, Putin made a speech to some religious leaders I believe it was in Moscow, certainly it was in Russia, because he doesn't get about much anymore. And he was saying, well, Russia stands for, and I believe he did use that word, the truth. Russia stands for the truth, and Russia stands for justice. Russia stands for peace, all of which, alarm bells ringing in your head, because this doesn't make any sense, does it? And then he went on a little bit of one of his diatribes, his digressions, that, well, the West is all about cancel culture. We're not about cancel culture, right? So the West is about cancelling. Russia is about cancelling. It's this sort of constant twisted logic. And the West is about gay rights. Therefore, we must be opposed to gay rights. And there is this sense of sort of shifting sands, and the state, modern culture makes this very easy, as I'm often talking about in the book. Social media makes this really easy. The sands constantly shift, and what it means to be Russian can constantly shift in response to whatever the West is doing. And the West and America remains, as much as Putin wants to make out it's not true, the dominant power in the world. But there is also an element of spirituality about this. Right, this sense of the capital T truth, a religious truth. A truth that isn't about fact and fiction, but a truth that's talking about, and Jakub, you mentioned this word, transcendentalism. Right, we search for the truth, and we aim to access the truth, and we aim to live the truth. This is elements from Christian discourse that are deployed within what you might term everyday political rhetoric, but nothing in Russia anymore is everyday.
So that would be sort of Georgi Lukasz's point that it is a very Russian state of mind to say that you can lie all your way to the truth. You can lie so well that your lies will sort of be transmutated into the capital T truth.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, if we talk about social media and mediatized realities, if we're getting in depth with the theorists and the thinkers, think about Baudrillard, right? And think about the idea of the hyper-reality. And Baudrillard, writing in, several decades ago, basically saw it all coming. the idea that we can live exclusively in virtual realities, and those realities seem to us much more real than anything that is empirical. And I would argue, and you know, you can read Peter Pomerantsev on this as well, although I have a bit of a difference with the way I think about this than Peter Pomerantsev, that Russia as a country, as a political entity, and the multifaceted discourses that exist within Russia, because there are still many different political discourses, enable people to live within this hyper reality, within a virtual reality. The difference that I have with postmodernists like Pomerantsev is that they say that the aim of the Russian state is simply to fragment meaning, you know, to take the mirror and smash it apart so that nothing means anything anymore, and you can't glimpse what's real. I would argue that the state is very keenly aware, and people like Dugin and Solovyov in particular are very keenly aware, that digital realities enable you to produce an infinite number of what appear to be whole mirrors. And therein people can live. They can find themselves. They can find worlds where they want to exist. And the state finds it easy to be in those spaces.
Okay, so one last question on this, and the mic is yours, Jakub. Is this whole operation motivated by the fact, and I'm putting it out as a hypothesis, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, that actual Russian life is about as bleak, dark, short, tragic, and wholly unsatisfying as you've described in your book. I mean, the chapter about the guy who lives in Arkhangelsk is probably one of the most depressing things I've read during the last couple of months, and because the actual daily lives are so empty and depressing, they seek out artificial realities, and they live in this make-believe world of Russian imperial glory and of the Russian leadership having a direct line to God and history, and they are all participating in something grand and great and just outside of the normal, outside of the banal. And they see the West as being hooked on banal and trivial endeavors, whereas they deal with the spiritual, the great, the numinous. Is there an element of anesthesia in this?
I think there is, but there are two things that I want to draw out. The first is, it's not just the broken and the battered, the people living in that sort of Hobbesian, brutish, short life that are attracted to these visions. And actually, the guy from Arkhangelsk that you talk about, Ivan Kondakov, yes, his life in the 1990s was brutish and terrible, but at the time he grew up,
he's probably basically middle class, yeah.
Yeah, he was having a great time. And, you know, his lifestyle would be immediately recognizable to many people in Poland as a sort of pretty good post-communist lifestyle. Suddenly he finds himself speaking English, traveling widely. He has a PhD. He has a nice job in aerospace engineering. Middle-class professional, according to all the boxes, all of the logic in the world. He should be looking at Putinism and looking at war and looking at events like the Crimea invasion, which have tanked his ability to travel and the value of his ruble pay packet. And he should be saying, well, you know, up yours, Putin. I don't want any part in this. And yet there is this sense that the spiritual aspect of it appeals to give life meaning. Right. And this is what myths do. Myths are not about lies. Myths are about making ordinary human lives that are born in medias res, in the middle of things without significance. It is about imbuing them with this great sense of living through something significant.
It's easy to dismiss the cultural war component of this as somehow absurd, and I understand why phrases like cancelling cancel culture in the mouth of somebody like Vladimir Putin might sound absurd, but don't you think there is an element of legitimacy to it, that people do find modern Western world in many ways terrifying, too complicated, too imposing on the so-called traditional way of life which they've enjoyed so far, and the resentment against the postmodern West is widely shared within the West itself. Otherwise, so many elements of Russian propaganda wouldn't work in countries as different as Spain, Germany, the UK, US and Canada if people weren't in some way receptive to this form of argument. Like, there is a traditional, patriarchal, orderly, godly society like Russian one, and it is you who deviated from the basic norm of Western culture. I myself wrote a book on American alt-right, and as you surely know and remember, there was this moment around 2013, 2015, that the belief that Vladimir Putin is basically a conservative leader with his values up straight and in a good and ordered in a good way was not so uncommon within the American right at the time. So how legitimate and how appealing these concepts are, in your opinion, both within the Russian society and broader in the West, as they feed on this very discontent?
Well, I mean, you've really hit the nail on the head, right? And Putin is exploiting a time when we too, as Western societies, are fragmenting, right? And we're finding it hard to agree on what we agree on, and we're finding it hard to agree on the nature of reality and the nature of what a society should be in a way that we just haven't had to do for decades in the West. And man, we could make this a really, really long debate. So I'm wondering where to start, thinking about Fukuyama and how misguided the idea is, even though I think poor Fukuyama gets it in the neck a bit more than he should, because his work is a bit more nuanced than it's given credit for. But he's become the standard bearer for the idea that, we're all moving in a particular direction. We, as historians and analysts, we've been very slow to recognize the fact that during the Cold War, the world was not divided, and ideologically, the world was not simply divided between the West and the East and people in the East who were all desperate to break free of every last part of their traditional society and become what we'll lazily call American, right? And in particular in Russia in the 1990s, that led to a series of huge missteps. Basically sending along the economics faculty of the University of Chicago and throwing in some shock therapy and seeing what would happen without tending to the cultural aspects of this. And it is my strong belief that, there is no norm for society. There is no natural state of society. And, I come back to Hobbes and I come back to Rousseau, and I don't think either of them are really right. Every society is different because society is built so based on contingency. And as we look forward, we have to ask, what is the offer that the West can make to its own population, as we see that, we see events in the Netherlands this week with the election, which has clearly been hugely divisive. I'm not going to talk about Poland because I think it'll upset people. Look at Hungary, which is changing very rapidly. Look at the struggles people are having in Britain. This debate is happening in Canada here, and over all of this looms the American election next year, which at the very, very best is going to be hugely divisive and hugely fragmenting, and that provides more opportunities for Putin and his propagandists to play themselves off against this. And it's also been a mistake, and this is the last point I'll make on this, as analysts of what the Putin regime has been doing, is to assume that all they have been trying to do in the West is to shatter and break and fragment and create divides. They haven't, because as Jakub, you recognize, they've also been trying to create these transnational, what we can more or less call global networks of like-minded people. Now, whether you agree with certain elements of their beliefs or not, you have to recognize that if you're in bed with Vladimir Putin, then you're in the wrong bed. And I think if you can't agree on that, then I'm not even sure where to start talking.
Speaking of being in the wrong bed, we've had an ex-Polish diplomat on this podcast, and we've asked him about what exactly is it that attracts so many people in the West to Russia? Because being a diplomat in Moscow, he's made quite a lot of people from the United States, from Canada, Britain, France, Italy, Germany, who were absolutely fascinated with what they saw. And he said, well, there are the obvious things, resources and easy money and all that, but you can't understand it without mentioning sex. And he said that basically Russia is the dream of a middle-aged Western man. It's everything he's ever wanted, but he was told that he can't have it. He was told that it's somehow against the rules of polite society, whereas in Russia, pretty much anything goes. And he told a story of a German manager of a very huge Russian company, and he was talking to a Russian, and he said, "Well, how do you get along with the German manager?" And he said, "Well, at first it was very difficult. I mean, he was driving this ecological car when everyone else was driving those big, expensive sports cars, and of course he brought his wife, so he wouldn't go drinking out with us and all that because he had to go back because his wife didn't know the city and so on and so forth. But just half a year later, he sold his hybrid car. He bought one of them flashy sports cars. He left his wife for a 30-year for a secretary, 30 years his junior, and he said, "Well, now he's a Ruski человек. Now he's a Russian man. Now he's one of us." So, would you agree that there's this dark attraction that Russia has through sex and machismo?
Yeah, I mean, this German dude sounds like he was going through a midlife crisis, and in some ways, I wonder if the West is going through its own midlife crisis right now and trying to figure out what are the norms and the rules, and those who feel, rightly or wrongly, like they've come out the losers of these debates and these battles are going to be attracted to places and political visions that seem to offer them power back, seem to offer them stability, and seem to offer them strength. Now that's, again, it's a very Hobbesian view of the world, I guess. But I think there's something in that, and there's something in when you see the more extreme ends of the American right, the way that they talk about Putin and Russia. Absolutely, there is an element of sort of masculinity and toxicity about this that is at times quite frightening. And where it really frightens me is where it comes hand in hand with the talk of violence. And the idea that to be masculine, you must be violent, and that violence is the norm of the world. That's where, for me, morally and ethically, it crosses over into something that is beyond the pale, shall we say.
And you have to disrespect women, which is also a part of the, shall we say, official state propaganda, that in a way women are there to support our glorious and valiant men.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen this increasingly in the last few weeks in Russia. We're now seeing talk of a potential ban on abortions. Now, is that, once again, to come back to the same discussion, is that a sort of transcendental spiritual issue, which the church would present it as? Or is that a response to the political demographic crisis that they're having and the need to make more children, whether it's for waging war or whether it's simply to prop up the economy because you're running out of people, as many countries are? There's no obvious answer. But when you look at the lessons, and that's what I've done in the book, when you look at the lessons that children are being taught, it is that little girls are being raised to be mothers, to be child bearers, principally, to stay at home and to do, if they work, to work in helping professions as teachers, carers, nurses. And it is the men who are the faces of war. And there is a really interesting change in Russian culture around this. Because when you look at World War II, there were so many famous female soldiers right? It was a phenomenon that there were thousands of female soldiers, and many of them were hailed by the newspapers and profiled in movies and so on and so forth. And now the state has very deliberately chosen to go back to very traditional gender roles.
But this is something that simultaneously happens in China today and is not implicitly or explicitly motivated by war. So we can also tie this in, or which is not the topic of this conversation, but to a broader reactionary impulses within regimes worldwide, which is a more complex question. You've mentioned school and lessons. I know Marcin wanted to dwell on this a bit, so let me ask this question up front. What is so, apart from these patriotism lessons, what is in the Russian school that you believe is so formative, and what is exceptional about Russian school and school experience in modern Russia today, which differentiates it from broader Eurasian context?
So, I mean, schools are becoming increasingly militarized. We've seen this over the last 10 years in particular. There was move to become more traditional, more conservative in education in the 2000s, to do away with liberal experimentation from the 1990s, although that was fairly abortive at the time. But really over the last 10 years, it's become the case that almost any subject can be militarized and patriotized. Most obviously in the history curriculum, in the social studies curriculum, where what is being taught is this sort of spiritual, transcendental language of Russian history. Is all quite baffling and pretty out there. But even in, for example, I've seen IT textbooks and IT homework that had Z symbols woven into it. So anything can become military. Outside of sort of regular classroom teaching, it's becoming more normal to have sort of patriotic events and quizzes, games, visitors from the military. Wagner are not, or were not, coming into school very regularly, but they were. But military recruitment is normal in schools for 18, 17-year-olds. You know, people coming in saying this is a career, and it's not just a career option in terms of money, but this is socially, this is the right thing to do. This is the way that you become a good Russian man. You can look at younger children who are being treated to patriotic education, music, popular culture through schools. And then you have, against the background of this, the youth army, this paramilitary youth group that is growing in size, which has branches in just about every high school in Russia nowadays, and whose members dress up in their youth army uniform and are a presence in schools. You're seeing plaques to fallen soldiers from the local area being erected in schools. You're seeing more and more Victory Day content spread from 9th of May itself and the week of 9th of May out bit by bit, week by week. A bit like, you know, Christmas has already started about 3 weeks ago here, you know, well in advance of Christmas. Well, Victory Day is this sort of ongoing festival of militarism. And so it's easy to point to each one of these phenomena and say, well, it's not going to be very useful. And, you know, on social media, you'll see a picture of school kids being visited by some old veteran and then looking bored to tears, as most 12-year-olds would be if some old man came to talk to the military and reminisce about the war in Afghanistan to them. But it is the drip by drip, the creeping militarization. There's a theorist, Cynthia Enloe, who's talked about militarization a lot. It is the creeping into every aspect of day-to-day life that is what makes this effective. There is no sort of big slam dunk moment that the state has. It's everything put together.
In your book, you write about a very moving story about a little girl of Central Asian origin who is sent to school. I think it was Moscow. It was one of the major cities. And she faces daily racist abuse from her classmates, and she basically faces abuse on every street corner. Now, there are certain sections of the global left which consider Russia to be the par excellence anti-racist, anti-colonialist state, and they would often point out to how diverse Russia is ethnically. Whereas when reading your book, you get the you get the impression that it's almost apartheid South Africa, that it's ethnic Russians and the rest are spat on and despised. How is it possible that in this day and age, racism is so prevalent in Russian society?
I wouldn't quite go so far as to call it apartheid South Africa, but Russia is a deeply racist state, and it is a deeply racist place, despite the presence of many, many nationalities, and despite the fine words of Vladimir Putin, who regularly says we're a multi-ethnic state and we welcome people from all over the world, and we'll point to those demographics and we'll point to the hundreds of indigenous nationalities, Central Asians, and so on and so forth. But it is state policy that white ethnic Russians are the first amongst equals. And it is state policy that to become a good member of the Russian community, ethnic minorities should be striving to transform themselves and to become more Russian. And it's interesting, actually, that you noted that German manager who was accepted as a Russian, because it's almost like becoming Russian is a state of mind and a series of behaviors rather than actually something that you're born with. But to do so, to become Russian, you have to shed other aspects of your identity. There was, a couple of months ago, a recruiting campaign run by the Youth Army online, and they had little video snippets, 30 seconds, a minute long, introducing members of the Youth Army. Now, almost all of them were white ethnic Russians, and the one that stood out for me, though, was the story of a girl from, I believe she was from Uzbekistan, who was 17 or 18, so she's at the top end of the Youth Army's membership. And she spoke very quickly, it's only a minute long, about coming to Moscow aged 10 and feeling much like the figure in my book, actually, completely excluded, didn't speak the language, people were mean to me, people were rude to me, I didn't feel a part of anything at all. So basically, she states in this recruiting video, between the lines, Russians were racist towards me. And then she says, but then I joined the Youth Army and I transformed myself. And now I speak great Russian. And I really, I feel included or I fit in or whatever she said. Right? She's saying this in perfect, accentless Russian. The only discernible ethnicness about her, apart from the fact that she says she comes from Uzbekistan, is the fact that, she's dark-skinned. She looks Central Asian. But she is dressed up in this perfectly crisp Youth Army uniform, the red beret. She has become Russian. She's sort of performing her Russianness. But she can't, within the Youth Army space, say, I'm proud to be Uzbek, but I'm also proud to be in the Youth Army. That is language that never exists. You cannot find it.
I was talking to Professor Marlene Laruelle from George Washington University about Russian identity a couple of months ago, and what she told me is that in the 21st century, the Russian vision of itself wasn't militarized and as nationalistic as today at first. What she says, it's the plan A was to become a cultural capital of the region, to employ some sort of soft power and to become an attractive place for migrants, for skilled workers, for intelligentsia and the yuppies of the whole Central Asia and Eastern Europe. And only, she says, after it failed, Russia moved towards more nationalistic and resentment-filled way of seeing itself, especially in relation to the West. I have the feeling that this isn't something you totally agree on, but I'm very interested. How would you respond to that, and what is your interpretation of this history of Russia failing as an attractive cultural capital, soft power capital of Central Asia, and then transforming itself quite consciously into a more nationalistic vision of nationality and its place within the region?
Well, my view on this is actually not as opposed to what Marlene says as you might imagine. And the point that I really want to underline is that in the 2000s, that first decade of the 21st century, what the state really did was it really did live this postmodern reality. And this is what Peter Pomerantsev is so good on as well. But the idea was to pump people up with the possibility of this, dreams are coming true, to kind of live the fairy tale. And that's, as I note in the book, that's something that Putin literally says in that very first speech he makes, 31st of December 1999. Here is your new president. Here he is on New Year's Eve. He says, we're born to make fairy tales come true, or something pretty close to it, which is a line from the Soviet Union from the 1930s. And that meant being a pop culture destination. It meant being a soft culture power. But it is very unwise looking back, and it's easy to see why we didn't look at it at the time. It is very unwise to dismiss the fact that Russia was militarizing in the 2000s. It was invading Chechnya in a very brutal fashion. It was pursuing this policy of so-called managed nationalism at home, which basically involved recruiting far right-wing gangs and neo-Nazis to go and beat up anybody who didn't seem to be Russian and straight enough. Right? Those two things could coexist, and they did coexist. And the point that I make in the book, and this is what I want people to understand, is that during the 2000s, you could live that sort of dream, bubbly, frothy lifestyle in Moscow and never see the violence. You could choose not to look at it. And we did the same in the West. We chose not to look at the violence. We chose to interpret it as an aberration, as something that happened from time to time, as something that was unusual, rather than something that was just as central to the state's project as was the creation of the soft power. Right? And this, again, it's mythical. Right? We have these opposing, Northrop Frye, who is probably my favorite scholar of myth, talks about these opposing darknesses and lights, and he talks about them in terms of a symphony, right? Where you have the tonic and the dominant chord, the first and the fifth, constantly working, wrapping around each other, unresolved. And I strongly suspect that in the 2000s, the reason that we didn't really get this is that we didn't want to recognize that those debates were continuing in Russia that had gone on in the 1990s between nationalists and really extreme nationalists and communists and liberalizing thinkers. We wanted to say, Putin has come in, we understand him, he's a soft authoritarian, he's a guy that we can work with. That was the mistake.
The objection that one often hears is that when one criticizes not as much Putin as Russian society as such, one often hears that, oh, what you're doing is you're essentializing. You have this Orientalist view of Russia, whereas in reality what we have there is a type of society that has been subjugated by an authoritarian power, by an alienated elite, and if only the true Russia could speak up, we would see a very different picture. And you often hear these days that the soldiers, they don't want to fight, they don't want to die, they have personally nothing against Ukraine and Ukrainians, they were forced to fight, or that most of the fighting is done by people, shall we say, on the fringes of civilized society, convicts, gang members, and so on and so forth. Therefore, we should not consider Putin and the Kremlin as being valid representatives of what Russian society actually looks like. Now, how would you respond to that argument?
Well, I certainly shy away from essentializing any society, and I've talked about the fact that I'm a constructivist, and I think society is constructed in terms of contingent events and contingent actions. Russians are not inherently anything. Just as Polish people or British people or Canadian people are not inherently anything because society is constructed. But ultimately, when it comes to Russians' enthusiasm for war and participation in war, I always come back to Vasily Grossman's novel Life and Fate. And I don't know if either of you have read it.
Yeah.
But Grossman's logic in it, there is a central character, Ikonikov, who is an icon Right? So therefore imitation, if you're an orthodox thinker. And Grossman's character finds himself in the concentration camps and refuses to participate in building the gas ovens, and essentially writes a sort of last will and testament where he says, well, I know if I refuse to do this, I know that I will be killed, but I refuse to participate in the killing of others. And I always reserve the right to say no. And you always have that right to say no. And there's nothing that more bloody drives me mad than the idea that Russians are politically apathetic. You cannot, in an increasingly totalitarian society like Russia's, be apathetic. You either choose to participate or you choose not to. And it is extremely hard not to. And I have infinite empathy for people who refuse to participate. And I understand how very, very difficult it would be if you're in that position to say no, that I will not do this. And I don't know whether I would be strong enough if I were living in that society to say no, I refuse. And yet, what we find is that there are thousands of Russians at the front in Ukraine who are willing to pull the trigger, to kill Ukrainians, to rape Ukrainians, to abuse Ukrainians, to torture Ukrainians. There are thousands of Russians who behave in the racist ways at home that we've discussed. There are thousands of Russians, millions of Russians indeed, who are willing to participate in extreme nationalist projects. And
is it blind obedience to power, or is it enthusiasm and elation?
Well, we know, and there are a number of different ways of slicing this up. I've done it in one way in the book by looking at it from more of a kind of ethnographic perspective, more of a cultural studies perspective. But, you can look at the polls as well, which are infinitely contested, but pretty much most people are in agreement that right now something around 15 to 20% of the population is all in on the war and on the conduct of the war, the way it's being conducted. Now, what's Russia's population? 130 million odd? Now, let's take the lower end of that estimate, 15%. What's 15% of 130 million? 19 million people. That is more than enough people to prosecute a large-scale war. That is more than enough people to continue to run a society like Vladimir Putin and his allies want to run. You do not need to have everybody on board in order to get what you want to achieve.
I cannot help myself but come back to the war on terror argument you yourself used in the beginning of our today's conversation. It's not so hard to see and imagine that we, not so far ago, also have lost our collective minds and allowed our governments to do unspeakable things. And in a rarely mentioned statistic, the biggest factor of a death toll of American soldiers is by suicide, which in the past 20 years, which means they must have seen so many abhorrent things in their lives and despised what they've done so much that some part of those 40, I believe, thousand who took their own lives were so traumatized and so desperate and so fed up with what their life become, they've decided to take their own lives in a tragic way. So I think I wonder how different that is and what's so exceptional and what's so, you think, dangerous in Russia's today, willful ignorance or acquiescence to Vladimir Putin's war aims in Ukraine?
I would say a combination of ignorance, acquiescence, and enthusiasm. But if we think about that question of soldiers, this is something I really want to think about over the next few years. The Russian state has sent hundreds of thousands of people to fight in Ukraine, and it has essentially no trauma treatment for its soldiers. I mean, it doesn't really train its soldiers either, so it's not doing trauma treatment after they come home.
No, they dish it out. They don't receive it. They're in the trauma-inducing business.
Exactly, right? And Russian society is going to be plagued for decades to come by these people returning from the front, whether that means on a very localized level in the way that they treat their families, the way they treat their communities, or whether that means at a political level. And you need only look back to the men who came back from Afghanistan towards the end of the 1980s and their political careers, and the Afghansi, as they are known, have generally tended towards becoming much more extreme nationalists and have moved away from rejecting war and rejecting some of the projects that Putin has proposed. And I wonder, and this is pure speculation, there's no way I can prove it as an academic, but it's worth thinking about, in 20 years' time, regardless of what happens to the Russian state between now and then, regardless of what happens to a maturing generation of patriotic children, will those soldiers who are now 20 but would be in their mid-40s, will they embrace nationalism and war in the same way that the Afghan veterans have over the last couple of decades? I don't know, but it's quite alarming to think about. And there are other historical parallels beyond this, but there's another point that I want to make, and that is to think about Ukraine. And to say that one of the most important things that the West needs to be doing with Ukraine is, and I know the Ukrainian government is working on this, is to think about trauma treatment for the soldiers who fought.
Well, speaking of the soldiers, when I think of all the atrocities that were committed, I mean, the mass murder, the mass rape, the torture in places like Bucha or Irpień, it strikes me that it didn't really serve any political purpose. It wasn't the sort of Stalinist genocide where you kill a category of people because you want to do ethnic cleansing or because you feel like the kulaks will die out anyway because of huge macroeconomic changes, so why not shoot them? Eventually they will disappear as a class either way. Or you shoot 20,000 Polish officers because they could be members of a ruling elite of a country that you want to govern yourself, so you get rid of them. In Bucha you have none of this. I mean, it's just wanton destruction and rape and murder. Do you have any idea about why it is that the Russians are conducting this war in that manner? Does it serve any purpose outside from just bloodlust? Perhaps there are no answers; there are only choices. But I wonder if you have another take on this.
I mean, there's, just to bring up one thing that isn't mentioned enough, I think, when it comes to these incidents, and that is the importance transnationally that rape and arbitrary violence plays in military bonding. And I went to a really convincing talk about some incidences in Africa and the Middle East by a scholar called Jessica Ochter, who is she at the University of Quebec or the University of Montreal? I'm not sure. One of the ones in Quebec, where she just laid out the statistics, and she'd done some interviews with people who'd been victimized by this sort of stuff, and soldiers as well, who said that, this was part of our sort of, not an initiation ritual that was forced on us, but we conducted ourselves this way because we felt like somehow this brought us closer together. And so throw that in, plus the toxic language you hear from Russian propaganda about, killing Ukrainians and Ukrainians being subhuman, they're being, they are vermin, and that is not language that is unusual to hear. You end up with a group of soldiers who may not understand really the political messaging of the state. They may not be able to recite to you the theological underpinnings of Alexander Dugin's thinking. But like most people, and like Soviets in the 1930s, have this vague sense that this is a morally acceptable thing to do. And then have this sort of on-the-ground group dynamic and group enthusiasm for it, and it creates a very, very dangerous and heady concoction. And you end up with stuff that's just too nightmarish to think about.
Mm. One thing that struck me in a really powerful manner was the fact that the Ukrainian army liberated one of the towns which was previously taken by the Russians. And outside there was a very nice suburb of nice little homes and just basically the American dream in the middle of Ukraine. And what the Ukrainian soldiers had found and they photographed it was a graffiti done by the Russian soldiers that said, "Who said you could live like this?" So there's an element of vengeance. You don't want others to have the good life when you live this miserable life in the middle of Siberia, whatever it is that those soldiers came from.
Exactly, and again, if you look at the historical comparisons, and everybody hates it when I make historical comparisons to Nazi Germany, but members of the Wehrmacht and the SS were not all super highly indoctrinated people who'd sat there and memorized every line of Hitler's speeches. They didn't get the philosophy, partly because the philosophy was as ragged and illogical as Putinist philosophy, if you can even call it that, was. You have people who take these vague snippets from it. The rage, the frustration, the sense of being the losers of history, the sense that we need to destroy and fight to make something great again. And you end up destroying those moral boundaries that usually constrain people.
Ian, you've been very generous with your time, and I'm deeply thankful for that. But before we finish, I want to ask the question everybody hates, and it's very general. But how does this end? Because we've mentioned the consequences, the generational trauma, but we've shied away from immediate political circumstances, like Ukraine losing international support, Russia propping up its GDP by increased ammunition production, and sanctions failing in certain regards. So if you can be bothered for more on-the-spot analysis and sharing your views on the future trajectories of this, both the conflict and the Western response, I would be more than glad to hear them.
The point that I want to draw attention to when it comes to understanding fascism, this is to go way back to our very first question, is that fascism demands war. Fascism wages war for its own sake. There is no strategic goal that military planners can put their fingers on and say, tick the boxes, we've done it. And therefore, if it's not this war, it must be some other war. The war has to keep rolling on, whether it's internal war, external war. It doesn't matter. And it is not going to stop with Putin, unless something changes within Russian society, because there is no liberal white knight, right? There are plenty of liberals within Russia. I'm not saying all Russians are evil. But there is no white knight who has anything near the reach or the power to come in and build even an opposition movement right now, let alone actually get their hands on the front door keys to the Kremlin. And therefore, you are going to see, I predict, a generation of young Russians who grow up with this highly militarized environment and propaganda around them. And just like those soldiers in Bucha, they may not buy into all of it. They may not understand all of it. But they may have a very different moral, ethical, and spiritual code to what we have. And we need to be ready for that. And we need to start thinking about it now instead of thinking about it in 20 years' time or in 10 years' time when some other war breaks out.
Ian, thank you for this very enlightening and very sobering conversation. I hope that your book will reach quite a lot of people because it shows us a very visceral, very powerful, and I think a very real image of Russia that we have to start to internalize. And for all the books by Dostoevsky and Tolstoy that we've all read, that's a portion of the truth, but there is also the ugly portion of the truth, which you have shown so well, both in your book and in this interview, and I thank you for it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I was going to say it was a pleasure, and in an intellectual sense it was. Emotionally, it was quite a harangue. One very last thing. We have a tradition here of recommending things we would like our viewers to familiarize themselves with, like books, games, movies, articles, analyses. Would you share something that you've been reading or paying your attention to in the recent weeks and months that we can recommend to our viewers as well?
Oh gosh, I've been trying to read normal stuff. I'm still recovering from thinking about the book.
That's perfectly right.
You know what? If there's something I can recommend, though, it is to watch the 2013 movie Stalingrad, which is a big budget Russian-produced movie. It was a huge box office smash, unusually for Putinist propaganda movies, which tend to be quite terrible and unappealing. Watch that, and you will understand a lot about the way that Russia thinks about war and sacrifice and death. And in particular, think what happens to the heroes, because in American war movies, the heroes always survive. And that is all I'll say.
Ian, thanks so much for this. Thanks for your time. And it was really good to have you here with us. And anytime you're in Poland, don't forget to hit us up.
Cheers.
Cheers. Thank you.